I'm Travis Bader, and this is the Silvercore Podcast. Join me as I discuss matters related to hunting, fishing, and outdoor pursuits with the people and businesses that comprise the community. If you're new to Silvercore, be sure to check out our website, www.silvercore.ca, where you can learn more about courses, services, and products that we offer, as well as how you can join the Silvercore Club, which includes $10 million in North America-wide liability insurance to ensure you are properly covered during your outdoor adventures. We have observed that the Silvercore Club has a high number of first responders in its ranks, which totally makes sense given the quality of person that our club attracts. I am so excited to pre-announce a full tuition-paid scholarship for one lucky person wishing to be trained as a firefighter through the Smart Fire Academy. This is a massive leg up for anyone with aspirations of being a firefighter. Follow us on social media and watch our website for details on how you could win. All right, listeners, welcome back to the Silvercore Podcast. If you're enjoying what you hear, please like, comment, and subscribe, and make sure to share this with others. Today I'm joined by Ian Runkle, a renowned Canadian criminal defense lawyer who specializes in firearms law. Welcome, Ian.
Thank you, and I should comment that specialized is probably the wrong term here, because specialized is a term that is restricted by the Law Society, and they is only for people who have sort of been qualified as such, and they don't, so far as I know, actually have a qualification program. So it's not a term I'm sort of allowed to use, but I do have an interest in firearm law. It's been an area of fascination for me pretty much since, actually, law school is sort of where I fell in love with firearm law. And the reason for that is that, so law school is stressful, and it's kind of famously stressful.
Yeah.
I got to a point where I needed a hobby, and the sort of main contenders for hobbies when you're in law school are kind of alcohol related.
Mm.
And I need a hobby that doesn't just involve drinking, because that doesn't seem like a great life strategy long term. So I need something sort of a little healthier. And so I remembered I'd enjoyed going plinking as a kid, and I thought, target shooting seems like not a bad approach. It's something I can do on my own. I can do it when I want to. So I went and got my license, and that was not too complicated of a process, but it's a process. And after that, I had the thought of, I really don't want to be, I don't want to be the guy who gets in trouble because he doesn't know the law. And especially as a lawyer or, prospective lawyer, you really want to make sure that you've got all that stuff down, because the court really takes a dim view of lawyers committing crimes.
Mm-hmm.
I thought, I don't want to sort of blunder into something. The storage rules are complicated. The transport rules are complicated. Let's really learn some of this, and at this point, I wasn't thinking I want to do firearm law. I was just thinking it's important that I know these things because I want to stay out of trouble. And my first thought digging into it was actually, I am really kind of dumb, because I was looking through all this and saying, I don't understand this. A lot of this doesn't make any sense to me. And obviously it has to make sense because this is, the firearm law. So I must be a little dumb here. And
sure, okay.
That was sort of my initial thought.
Yeah.
And then as I dug more into it, it was like, no, it's not me. I'm understanding it. It's just that the law is so complicated and in many places badly written that I went, And there were places where it seemed like the courts and the, lawyers maybe weren't understanding it, because there are places where the law splits. And what seems to have happened in those cases is that an issue gets decided one way by, in some cases, binding courts. And then it gets heard again, and nobody seems to be aware of those other prior cases. And so they don't get brought to the attention of the courts. They don't, they're not mentioned. And then the court goes and finds a different way. And then suddenly you've got these two separate interpretations. And so that makes it very difficult to, when somebody says, can I do this? I go, well, it really depends on which case, of these two sort of branching things, the court decides is the right one.
Interesting.
And so that kind of stuff is fascinating to me. I love the puzzles. I love the trying to figure all this stuff out. And so once I started finding just how much of that there was, I was like, this is what I want to do. And I know that that's kind of a terrible way to get into a profession, is where you're saying this is so badly written that I love it. But
you like the game.
I mean, there's
you gotta love it.
There's sort of a puzzle to it. You're trying to solve, like, here is what the law says. How does that actually work in practice? And, is this something where we can, are there places where this can be massaged in some fashion? Are there places where gaps in the law can be used to a client's advantage, or alternately, places where people can get trapped because there's all sorts of situations where you can think you're sort of right with the law, but be wrong about that. And so I try to clear those up for people, because I hate seeing situations where people who I consider morally blameless are being dragged before the courts. Even if they're ultimately acquitted, there have been cases where I thought the law was quite clear on something, but somebody ends up spending thousands of dollars fighting it.
Punishment by process.
I mean, it's not intended to be punishment. They're not, but I don't think that the accused ever really thinks of it as not a punishment.
Right, totally.
And I've had times where, we've had to go to trial, and we've won quite handily. And the client says, well, how do I get my money back? Because, you're expensive, and I don't fault you for that, but can I get my money back from the Crown? And it's like, no. And, that's always a tough pill, because people are like, you mean I'm just out this money? And it's like, yeah. And, these are people who could see that I'd done good work for them, that I fought hard for them. But it's still kind of a rough thing to say, like, why did I have to hire somebody? Whereas, if you think of sort of analogs of, like, my car is parked out back, I can't see it right now. If somebody went and set fire to it, I probably wouldn't notice. I'd probably find out when the fire department or the police were knocking on my door going, did you know your car is on fire? But if they found the person who did that to me, I'd be able to go after them and say, you owe me another car, right? You owe me the value of this car because you set fire to the one I had. But when people deal with sort of being harmed by the justice system, by, improper charges, there is no process to say, I need that back. I tell, one thing I tell people, and I actually sort of cribbed this off Marie Heinen, who's famous Ontario lawyer, just a real heavy hitter, an inspiration, quite honestly. But she was talking about how she tells clients that, I can't make it like it never happened.
Right.
But we can try to get you to the best possible future scenario of all the possible futures. That's what we're trying to aim for. And I think people sometimes have a real hard time with the whole notion of, I'm never going to be made whole. I'm never going to be made right from this.
Yeah. So I know I would.
Yeah. Well, so that's why I try to warn people and, and say, like, hey, this is a legal landmine. And you need to be aware that it's there. Don't go playing in that field, because it's going to go badly for you.
Well, you've brought up, this is going to be a fun podcast. You've brought up a bunch of things. I've been taking some notes as you're talking here. And one thing I should touch on, because we jumped right into this, is you've got a massively growing social media presence under the brand Runkle of the Bailey. And so people who have heard of this, and I'm going to just put this out here. I'm going to say a fair number of our listeners have probably already heard of you. But for those who haven't heard of Runkle of the Bailey, we're going to have some links in our blog, and there's going to be links attached to this podcast as well, so you can go check it out. You've got a YouTube channel, you've got a Patreon channel, you're all over Twitter, and you're sharing your thoughts and comments on laws and politics, but there's definitely a firearms flavor to it. So I just want to get that plug in. Check it out. It'll be in the bio. You won't regret it. There's a lot to learn there. You know, we talked about this earlier about a little disclaimer at the get-go that nothing you talk about here is going to be legal advice, but I figured I'll throw that in there. Whether it's worth a grain of salt or not saying it, we'll make sure we get it in.
Yeah, and I mean, if you ever are contemplating doing something, like the law is full of exceptions and weird sort of corner cases. So if you're ever saying, like, I want to consider doing something, or, you know, whenever the law starts becoming personal, you want to decide whether you should do something or not, or the police are at your door, that kind of thing. Once it's sort of outside the academic field, you should, you know, really talk to a lawyer about it, about your situation specifically, because sometimes, you know, when we're talking about the law, we might speak in generalities, but you might be personally within an exception, and that might be to your benefit or to your detriment, because there's, you know, it might be like, this is okay unless you're doing the specific thing you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
So
talking about police at the door, have you seen that? I'm sure you've seen it. That YouTube video with the very fast-talking counsel in the States who gives half of his time to talk about what he would advise a client to do if the police are at the door, and the other half he gives over to a police officer to give his thoughts on. Have you seen that YouTube video?
yes, I think that one's titled "Don't Talk to the Police." He's a law professor. I forget where he is, I believe, but I mean, there's a little bit in that that's sort of specifically American, but by and large, his, you know, what he tells people there is solid, and the reasoning for it is solid. People don't really realize how dangerous a police officer at your door is. And I don't mean dangerous in the sense of, you know, this officer is probably not going to draw his sidearm and shoot you.
Right.
You know, absent you giving them a very good reason, which I recommend not doing. But, you know, don't pull a knife on the cop. It's not going to end well for you. But
right.
People go in, and the thing I hear all the time from people is, oh, I just want to clear this up. Like, I am in the right, and I just want to clear this up. And it's like, first of all, you don't know if you're in the right. You just don't. Because you don't have the legal background, you don't have all the details. Second, you don't know what the cop's investigating. You don't know, and you don't know what's dangerous necessarily. And even if you do know all of these things, you're not going to be thinking straight enough to navigate this. I saw a talk from another lawyer quite recently, and they gave the example of a sexual assault allegation. And all the police needed from the interview was an admission that the person had met the complainant. That was it. That was all they wanted. And so that admission, which seems super low key, can be a big deal. I've seen people buried on admissions like, is this your car? That kind of thing.
Right.
You know, things that you don't think are dangerous questions can actually be super dangerous questions. You know, sometimes even your demeanor, your manner of speaking can end up being used against you. And, you know, I had one, I ran a trial, and some of the evidence against my, that came up was from his police interview, where he didn't say anything super incriminating, but just his accent, his voice. Because now they've got a recording of that, and then they can use it to match and say, is this the person you heard?
Right.
And, you know, so just that recording can be dangerous. You really want to be careful about all of that. And also, the other thing is, most people don't realize how many things are crimes and how many things are, you know, potentially forbidden. One that I see all the time is, and this is from a case that I really dislike. It's the case of the Queen and Falauca.
Right.
And it's a case where a guy who was quite frankly, he was being a jackass.
Mm-hmm.
He was riding the SkyTrain in Vancouver.
I remember this one.
He had a rifle wrapped up, or tucked under his jacket. I forget his precise means of sort of hiding it, but it was sort of, concealed in that fashion. Somebody noticed it, and then when he was asked why he had it, he joked that he was going to go on a shooting spree, which makes him super unsympathetic, right? Nobody is on this guy's side. But what the court's decision ended up being is basically that so long as the firearm can't be seen, it's counted as concealed, even if your purposes for doing so are good.
Mm-hmm.
Even if you're trying to not, do anything nefarious, you're not hiding it because you're planning on going up to somebody and shooting them or anything like that. But simply, things like you want to prevent your firearms from being stolen.
Mm-hmm.
You don't want your neighbors to know that they're there so that your neighbors can't break in and take them. Or you don't want to alarm people.
Mm-hmm.
But the court, so you'll see people saying, oh, look, this guitar case would make an excellent firearm transport case. And it's like, well, the Supreme Court's kind of said no on that. And, you should be aware of that, because as much as I don't typically see people charged for it, there's no reason why they couldn't. And
that was a crazy one. I remember the Filoco one. That was, you're right, totally not sympathetic at all. But wouldn't intent? Don't you think? I'm not a lawyer, but don't you think there'd have to be some level of intent in concealing? And I'll tell you why I asked this one after.
Well, there's always sort of some level of intent, but the Supreme Court has said that the appropriate level of intent for being punishable is that you intentionally placed it into a situation where it wouldn't be seen. So that so for instance, or, where it might not be detectable in some fashion. So you take your shotgun and you put it into a bag or a map case or something like that where it's, hidden.
Mm-hmm.
They're saying you don't need to have sort of bad intentions. It doesn't need to be a situation where you need to, where you need to be going after somebody.
Yeah.
The mens rea on that is really light. And so that's what we're stuck with. It's not a situation where it has to be like you're planning on robbing a bank or anything like that.
Yeah. I remember I had a call once. I was asked to put together a report for a local law firm. They had a fellow who's a trapper, and he had a revolver and licensed to have this thing. Good to go. I was talking with a conservation officer. Then they called in the police, and they were concerned because his revolver was on his hip. It was raining and cold and windy out, and he'd put a jacket on over top of it. And when they asked, where's his gun? Because he mentioned he had one. He says, he's not going for it. He's telling it's right down here. And they start looking through his vehicle for it. He said, no, over here, right? And he's motioning with his head. The listeners can't see me making the head motions here. And they tried to charge him with having a concealed weapon. And I'm not entirely sure how that one ended. I'm guessing positive, because I never had to go into court to give any information on that one. But that was where I was introduced to the Filoco one, because I was a part of his whole case there.
Yeah, and it's most people, of course, are not in a position where they can carry a revolver around on their hip.
Right.
But where you see it quite commonly is situations like people with a pocket knife. And people say, well, it's a pocket knife. Where was it? It was in my pocket. And, the main question can end up being, is this a weapon? But let's say you say something stupid to the police, which is almost anything that you say to the police.
Yes.
But, people, what happens is, like, let's say you're driving along and you got a speeding ticket a while back. And you were busy, maybe a family member died, maybe your house burned down, maybe all sorts of things, right? Life gets in the way. And so then you forget about the ticket. And in your absence, they have your trial day for the ticket. They convict you in absence. and then they give you a day that you have to pay. They send you a notice. But again, you're still dealing with life fallout, and this speeding ticket is the last thing on your mind.
Mm.
Well, eventually they'll issue a warrant for your arrest, that you've got these unpaid fines.
Mm-hmm.
And so then you get arrested and you get taken down to the station, and you're going to have to pay this, this ticket to get out. But in the course of getting arrested, you're going to get patted down because the cop does not want you in his car if maybe you've got a handgun in your jacket.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you've got, a brick of C4, whatever it is, they don't want you having.
Mm-hmm.
So they pat you down to make sure that you don't have anything dangerous, and they find this knife. And the question they'll always ask is, what's this for? And a lot of the time people say, oh, well, it's a real dangerous neighborhood. So that's why I've got this knife, is because, it's a real dangerous neighborhood and I might need to protect myself. And now they're charged with carrying a concealed weapon.
Yep.
Because now they've just admitted that it's there as a weapon, and that and it was carried in their pocket. And I can, in almost every case, you're talking about people who've never used this knife violently, would not use this knife violently, except if they were in danger for themselves in a real way. Somebody else has attacked them. These are not sort of dangerous people. But they're just people who are maybe a little too honest.
Mm.
Whereas sometimes I see sort of more practiced, seasoned, experienced people in front of the courts, which means that they've got a criminal record that might be a small novel. And the cop asks, why do you have this? And they say something along the lines of, get effed.
Mm.
And that's a much better statement, believe it or not. I mean,
Yeah.
Be polite to police. I recommend that generally, because you don't want to make the police officer have a personal interest in you, but still you don't want to give anything away. And that statement of, I had this for self-defense, is a terrible thing to say.
Mm.
And is actually worse than the go F yourself statement at the end of the day, because that guy didn't admit anything.
No kidding.
And, it might be that the first guy who made the admission has only ever used this knife for, opening chip bags. And the second guy has stabbed several people in his life.
Mm-hmm.
And it's still that second guy who's more likely to walk in that case. It's,
Yeah. Well, that's where experience comes in, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably that he's done some jail time to learn that lesson.
Mm-hmm.
And had a few rounds with lawyers saying, really, why did you say that to the police?
Yeah.
Before they learned it. But people don't necessarily like they don't like hearing, I will tell you, when they're sitting in your office and you say, you would have walked but for you talk to the police.
Yeah, no, I think that would be a hard pill to swallow.
It definitely is, especially with people who view themselves as sort of law-abiding and very much pro-social people. I mean, I've talked to people who have been like family members of police officers.
Mm-hmm.
And, one guy said basically, it's going to be real hard at Thanksgiving dinner because I've always had this very positive view of the police. And now that's been very much shaken. And, I'm going to have to decide whether or not I bring this up. And we might have a fight over this at Thanksgiving dinner. And I was just like,
yeah. Yep. Yeah. I've raised in a family of law enforcement, and being around law enforcement all my life. And it's just like any other profession. You're going to have the small few who are really good, the small few who are really bad, and the rest of the majority who are just plugging through the day, getting their way to retirement. And if it looks really difficult, maybe they'll leave it for somebody else. And it's just human nature, right?
Oh, for sure. I mean, I've told people, I said, like, there are police officers out there that I would absolutely, like, I mean, I got destroyed in a trial at one point because there was a small charter violation. The officer had screwed up. And he got up on the stand and admitted he screwed up and why he did and, so forth. And that just flattened me. Because I was hoping that this charter violation would be a bigger deal than it was. But once he gets up there and just, and he basically said, I screwed up. I'm sorry.
Mm-hmm.
And I've seen officers go above and beyond for things. I've seen officers just really really sort of
Sure.
go through heroic and exceptional circumstances.
Sure.
And I've seen officers who, quite frankly, and I'm not going to name any names, but there's, some people who I've just thought like, wow, you should be in jail.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of people are just doing their job. The
Sure.
same way that the guy, at the McDonald's who gets your order wrong probably isn't doing it because he hates you.
Right.
He's probably not like, screw that Runkle guy. I'm going to make sure he doesn't get his McNuggets. It's probably just that he's going through his job. He's not trying to do a bad job, but he's also really not super invested in it either.
Right.
And that's fine, but it also results in some mistakes, and it results sometimes in them saying like, listen, we'll let you said that you've got an innocent reason for having this knife. We'll let the courts sort it out.
Mm-hmm.
That'll be somebody else's problem down the road. And unfortunately for you, that might mean thousands of dollars of sorting it out down the road.
So, and I know we're going to talk about some firearm stuff, but knives that open under centrifugal force. Do you see many people actually getting charged under that? Because my question is, how much centrifugal force? I mean, if you attach it to a big long 2x4 and whip the thing out, you're going to get any folding knife to open up.
So the test is basically, could a person do that?
Sure.
But it doesn't necessarily have to be the average person. It can be the biggest, beefiest police officer on the force, and police officers tend, as a category, to be, stronger and more athletic than the average Canadian.
Sure.
So like the viewers can't see, but I've got scrawny, skinny little arms. So I might take a knife and I want to test it to make sure it's legal, and I might yard on this thing as hard as I can, and it just doesn't budge. But when you get a guy who can bench press my weight with ease all day and not tire, that guy might be able to snap that open. And so that would still put it in the category of illegal, which kind of makes it interesting that your court case can depend on basically, can they find a big enough cop to
to whip it out, or somebody who's got the technique down pat.
Yeah, but I mean, it excludes things like mechanical assistance, in the sense of either using a long lever, or if you attach this to some sort of spinning apparatus that spun really fast and then stopped suddenly to flick it out. That would also, if you built some like super powered robot arm to flick things out, I mean, you could build in theory a robot arm that could flick the blade head off of a fixed blade knife.
Right.
So, there's the limit is basically human capabilities, but not necessarily your capabilities. But you do get cases that hinge on whether the accused knew it, because sometimes it's like, there's one where they had a big beefy police officer there, and it took the police officer in court something like 6 tries to get it open. And they said, okay, the knife is itself banned. It's a prohibited knife because it's possible to flick it open. But I accept that this person didn't know that it was possible to flick open because it was real hard for this police officer to do.
Right.
So all of this is real complicated. But do I see people get charged? Yes, I do. And I mean, most of us don't typically come to the attention of law enforcement all the time. But, I've seen people picked up and charged with things that are, somebody who's watching TV too loud and the neighbors call it in and the police think it's a domestic violence situation when actually it was the TV. And, the police search them and find this knife and go, yep, that's a flick knife. And some of these knives that are actually readily available. I did a video where I noted that Home Depot at the time, I don't know, I haven't checked recently, but I assume probably still, was advertising the flick openable properties of some of their knives. Like they literally had a video of some people flicking it open. And, this is a selling point.
Sure.
And, quite frankly, there's all sorts of situations where, for lawful reasons, having a knife that flicks open is fantastic.
Sure.
I mean, if you're a climber and you are, clinging to a rope 400 feet above the ground and you need to cut something, two-handed operation is a real disadvantage.
Mm-hmm.
If you are in a confined space, somebody was talking to me about their seatbelt knife, a knife that they had for the purpose of getting out of the seatbelt. And now this thing, I don't know if it would count as a knife for the purposes of this law, because it was actually a sort of a hooked contained blade.
Right.
You wouldn't really be able to use this against a person.
Hmm.
But it folded open. And I said to them, I don't think that's what you want. And they said, well, why not? And I said, let's say you're in a situation where you've been in a car accident, you're pinned, your vehicle's half crushed, and you need to get out of your seatbelt right now. Can you guarantee you've got two hands to open this up in order to get that seatbelt cutter open?
Mm-hmm.
And they went, huh. I'm like, you might be doing this, reaching out one-handed to pick up the seatbelt cutter and doing that. And you might be doing it, in fact, with one broken arm that has no strength to it. So there's, I've talked to people who have one hand. Like, they literally lost it. Guy who's a veteran lost, a hand serving overseas. And he's saying, what do you mean I need a two-handed opening pocket knife? I've only got one.
The funny thing on that is, what's faster than having a knife that can flick open is one that's already open. And that's perfectly legal.
Oh, I mean, you could have a fixed blade knife all day. And in fact, a fixed blade knife is never going to run into the flick knife problem. You can't get charged with having a flick knife on a fixed blade.
Yeah, some of these things boggle the mind. But when I was doing some research here, I came across, speaking of boggling the mind, I came across I think it was an ATT condition challenge. It had your name attached to it. And the part that really got me, because I've heard it on more than one occasion, was, we are not denying you issuance of privilege certificate, authorization, whatever it might be. We're just not giving it to you.
Yeah. And that was a fun argument.
How does that work?
Well, in Alberta right now, it doesn't.
Okay.
So the argument that, so what happened here in this case was Alberta had been in the practice of putting gunsmiths on all long-term authorizations to transport. And this makes sense if you think about it, because you might have a problem where your firearm fails in an unsafe way, or possibly fails in a way where it might be illegal for it to continue to exist.
Mm-hmm.
Your gun, something has broken in it and it's now firing full auto.
Mm-hmm.
You don't want that. You want to correct this immediately, if not sooner.
Mm-hmm.
Now, let's say it's Friday and it's 4:30 p.m. CFO's gone home for the day. CFO's not coming back tomorrow, and they're not coming back the day after. They're going to be there first thing Monday morning. And you're thinking, but I want to take this to a gunsmith right now. I want to solve this. Or maybe you've got a stuck cartridge.
Mm-hmm.
And you're thinking, I want to get this cartridge out because this is a potentially dangerous situation. I don't want to be sitting here rocking a potentially loaded gun.
Mm-hmm.
And so so in Alberta, the practice was, we'll put gunsmiths on your long-term authorizations to transport. In Ontario, their practice was, we will not do that. So a couple of people in Ontario brought challenges saying, we want gunsmiths on our long-term ATTs. And they won in part because the practice in Alberta was to allow it.
Interesting.
And so the response to that was, they got all the CFOs together and they said, you can't put those on anybody's anymore. So Alberta then changed their policy to remove gunsmiths from all the long-term authorizations to transport. So I got one of these I renewed my license, got a new long-term ATT, and of course it does not have gunsmiths on it anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And so I say, I want gunsmiths back on it, please. And so I applied saying, I specifically want my long-term ATT to include gunsmiths. And so they said, well, we've issued you an ATT, a long-term ATT, but it's not going to include gunsmiths. And tough. And I sort of went, but that's not what I wanted.
Right.
So they said, tough. So I brought a challenge, and their argument was that the court didn't have jurisdiction to review it because they didn't refuse me an ATT. They just granted me a different one than the one I asked for.
Mm.
And the court did not have a whole lot of patience for that argument. And so the court basically said, sorry, if you are not granting it as requested, if you are leaving requested things out, then that is at least a refusal in part. And so you've got to, go through that proper process.
Right.
They don't like that decision. But, one of the things that they got challenged with in court was, the justice asked, so let me get this straight. If somebody asked for an ATT to go to the range and you instead said, no, we're going to issue you an ATT, but it says you can take your guns only to the police station for disposal, would that not count as a refusal? And they said, no, it would not. And the justice was like, that makes no sense to me.
Not at all.
So, obviously going with their argument would have permitted some pretty drastic abuses and dodging of the whole, dodging of the review process.
Mm-hmm.
And so ultimately the court said, no, that's a refusal. But we're still seeing that kind of argument. I mean, in my view, that's sort of what's going on with this whole AR-15 thing, where they said, we're not revoking your certificate. We're just declaring it as having been administratively expired. It's like, well, that's not a thing. You're just making up, it was nullified.
Yeah, it's a thing now because we just said it.
Yeah. They're trying to sort of write their own law is what it seems like to me. I mean, ultimately a court may or may not agree with me. This is going to be a major battle. I think it's likely to end up at the Supreme Court. But, because we've got court battles going on in every province, so far as I'm aware, multiple court battles, and they're coming up with different results, including within provinces. They're coming up with different results. So I don't see how this goes anywhere other than the Supreme Court, which might end up being my second trip to Ottawa.
Well, you brought up, a couple things I was writing down here. So one is, just as a bit of an aside, you're talking about, bringing a firearm to the police for destruction. If memory serves me correctly, there's actually there's provisions within the criminal code that allow for taking a firearm if it's being done immediately to the police for destruction. Is there not?
I'd have to check. I believe you still need an authorization of transport for restricteds. And the other thing is that the police really don't like it if you show up unannounced with a firearm.
No.
My grandmother did this, and this was some time ago, and I can tell this story because she's dead and therefore is not likely to be prosecuted, and she's also not going to get upset with me, at least not that I know of,
right?
For telling the story. But apparently there was a handgun in the family that, and this was like one of these old sort of self-defense ladies' purse pistols kind of thing.
Sure.
One that's able to hit a man-sized target at basically grabbing reach range.
Yeah.
People tried it out. It shot a group apparently about the size of a barn. And so it was not a great gun. Nobody wanted this thing, and it got turned, so she was figuring, I got to turn this into the police. And so she walked into the police station apparently and told them, I have something for you. And the officer's like, okay, and pulls out this gun out of her purse. And the officer snatches it out of her hand and was super unhappy about this. And she did not feel that she was well treated by that officer in that circumstance.
Yeah, probably not.
She felt that the officer was very rude. And, maybe should have, given her a little more regard in that moment. And I'm going, okay, but you could have been killed.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
don't show up at the police station unannounced with firearms. I've had a few situations where I've done, turn-ins, and it's always been a matter of, just so you know, here, I'm going to be bringing a firearm to you. Here's what I'm going to look like. Let's work this out ahead of time.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, in some of those cases, it's been a situation where, like, I walk into a busy police station, I sort of give the hand wave to the person behind the scenes, and they're like, let's take you over somewhere else.
Right.
So that we're not doing this in front of everybody's view. It's very, very subdued, but you really don't want to get anyone excited over the fact that you've got a gun in a police station.
No kidding.
Sometimes these happen like at the back door. It's just like, I will come to the back door. I will call you when I'm here. You guys could come up and I will just pop my trunk and you guys can pick it up out of there. And, everybody's got their own different procedures for it. But getting an ATT so that they know it's coming is not a bad idea.
Yeah, no kidding. I'm going to have to reread that section again, but obviously not a lawyer, and I'm not, I always stuck in the back of my head. I thought, the way I'm reading this, it looks like they might have an exemption if it's being, let's say you find a gun and it's not in a safe area and you want to bring it to the police.
There's a different provision for if you find one.
Right.
And that covers all sorts of exceptions as well. But that's different than if it's your gun.
Okay. And it was a found one that I read, and I've always wondered, what's to stop these guys, these gangbangers, from going around and say, oh, I just found this gun. I was just taking it to the police station when you pulled me over. I'm so glad you're here.
Well, and the thing is they absolutely could say that, but I guarantee you, if you are turning in, like, let's say you're off in the woods and, you find a handgun and, you call the cops as soon as you find this handgun. It's been clearly, chucked off an overpass and, it's in the bushes and you come across it. And you call the police, say, I found this handgun. I'm not touching it, but I want you to know where I am. Come pick it up.
Mm-hmm.
And the police come pick it up, and they take it to ballistics, and it turns out it was used in a murder 3 days prior. I guarantee you are on the list of people they are investigating with respect to, what's going on with this gun, because they will absolutely be... they'll absolutely have some questions for you.
Totally.
It's not going to be just like, oh, well, thanks for the gun. We have no follow-up questions and we don't need your name.
Well, that's where they go see somebody like yourself, get legal counsel who has the privilege of being able to drop something off and saying, I don't got to tell you nothing.
Yep. And, hiring a lawyer to do that sort of thing is a fantastic way to go. And, you can have situations where it's just like, hey, I'm a lawyer. Here's what's going on. Somebody wanted this reported. It's being reported. And they're like, well, who's your client? Fun fact about that. No. Well, we really need to know who your client is. Again, no.
Right.
And, the cops don't like that, of course, but, that might be better for your happiness.
Well, we've got opt-in and opt-out provinces, CFOs that are appointed federally or appointed provincially. Do you find on firearms-related issues that there's a lot of ball passing when you try and push something forward? As in, no, this is a federal issue. No, it's a provincial issue.
What I see more is that the feds have really tried to, take as much power as they can.
Okay.
They don't want to pass the buck. They want the buck. Okay. And so Bill C-21, for instance, proposes to take some power from the provincial CFOs.
Right.
And so, it's very much a situation where they're saying, we want to make sure the CFOs can't do things that are currently within their power.
Right.
And so, there was the whole firearms reference, which was basically the big question of, can the federal government legislate in this area? Because previously it was sort of viewed as a provincial responsibility. So yeah.
I'm sure, we're talking earlier, and you've been really busy with C21. I mean, there's so much insanity to unpack in that one.
It's a jam-packed bill full of things I don't agree with, and I think a lot of Canadians would have problems with, to be, honest.
If you were to, I just did a podcast a couple days ago, and by the time the listeners are listening to this, it'll be a longer span between it. But the opinion in there, that was with Daniel Fritter of Caliber Press and Ryan Stacey of IBI, and they're talking about the political side of all of this, and thinking that the chances of this thing actually being proposed as if it's going to pass are probably nothing to worry about. The actual law is something to worry about, but maybe this is just more of a political game. Would you view it from that same sort of perspective?
Yes and no. I mean, the thing that we have going on right now is that they are. I don't think this is going to get through in the current in the current sort of period. So right now, this iteration of the bill is probably not going to go through. But that doesn't mean that they can't reintroduce it later. Like that this bill isn't a problem.
Right.
And the Liberal Party has steadfastly defended the notion that there's any problems with it. They've said everything in this is perfect and is hunky-dory, and what are you guys getting upset about? So they may just, they may be using this as election fodder to try to get elected, but they may well try to bring this back in exactly the same shape it's in. Or they may not. It may be that this is one of these bills that they float now, try to bang the drum on for an election and then never bring up again.
Right.
So it's really hard to tell, but I don't think it's safe to assume that it's just not going to be a problem, because it really might. Well, and yeah.
Well, we're getting a lot of calls, that's for sure, from club members, from the general public, from media. Big concern is obviously around the talk of municipal handgun bans.
Yeah, and
it doesn't even seem constitutional, let alone, like, how do you affect something like this?
Well, the way they're affecting it is actually, and I'm going to have a video out on this. I hope it'll be out tomorrow, but we'll see.
Okay.
But they're actually adding it as a condition to people's firearms licenses. And so, as gun owners, we often say, oh, well, this is targeting law-abiding gun owners and not the criminals. And usually what we mean by that is that it's going to be something that the criminals will ignore. But this goes a step further. It's something that the criminals are actually immune to. Because you can only be prosecuted under the municipal handgun ban if you have a handgun license.
Oh my God.
So it's literally only, people with a license who can be charged.
Man.
And so, you and I are at risk from this law, but somebody who's a drug dealer doesn't care. Literally, if they literally cannot face, charges under it, they cannot be convicted under it. They are just completely immune. Yeah,
that makes a lot of sense, I mean, come on, give me a break.
I mean, it's it's very clear who they think the problem is when that's what the legislation says.
And then another one they're talking about is replicas. Now, replicas are already prohibited, but they're
already banned. What they want to ban now is kids' toys.
Right.
And I mean, I say kids' toys, although there are a lot of adults who play Airsoft as well.
Sure.
But they want to ban toys, is what it comes down to. So, I mean, there's a lot of people who are super upset by that because, there's a lot of people for whom Airsoft is a substantial aspect of their life. They view this as very, significant. I was talking,
right.
One guy was saying how, he's a new Canadian and, when he came here, he came and found that he had no community. He didn't know anybody here, and that it's really hard to make friends, right? It's,
sure.
As adults, people tend to have their friend groups. You're not typically looking to add more people to socialize with. And so what he found was Airsoft, because, the Airsoft community, he could sign up, like he could show up and people were happy to have him. And, even if his English wasn't great, people were happy to put the effort in because they had a shared interest.
Right.
And, so he said, these are the people he socializes with. These are the people, this is his community. And he was near tears talking about, they want to break that. Like, what do you mean they want to take this away from me? I'm going, and, I had various people from various sorts of walks of life, business owners and so forth, who have all been asking me to reassure them that the law isn't as bad as it seems. And unfortunately, I don't have a whole lot of reassurance for them.
Wow. I don't know if I read it correctly, but they were also saying something about, well, we'll make them prohibited, but those who already have them can keep them. Was that in there?
That was in there. Yeah, it's bizarre.
It doesn't make sense. If people are regular listeners and they've listened to the previous podcast prior to this, one of my solutions for the airsofters, and it'd be interesting to get somebody like yourself's perspective on this, if it was never designed as a replica to begin with, then it can't be considered a replica. For example, if you have a live firearm that is then deactivated, that is then guts pulled out and put some green gas and parts inside it, technically, I would think, not being a lawyer, that maybe you'd be okay.
That one would be legally questionable. The one that's legally not questionable is they make airsoft gas shotgun shells.
Okay.
And these are deliberately sized to not match to any existing gauge of firearm. Because they really didn't want them fitting in an existing gauge of firearm.
Mm.
But you could build, like 3D print a sleeve or something to fit into it, to make it properly fit into, for instance, a 12 gauge.
Subchamber.
Yep.
Yeah.
And then you could run around with these airsoft shotgun shells loaded into actual 12 gauges, shooting at each other.
So that just highlights the level of thought that was put into all this, I'm sure.
I mean, really what it comes down to is that the police have never liked airsoft. They've never seen much purpose for it, as an institution. And, they don't care if you have a hobby that's, enjoyable. Quite frankly, I think that they would have been happy to ban hydroponic gardening equipment, just to shut down grow-ups.
Yeah.
So, asking the police for a wish list of what they want to ban is not a great way to go about things, because the police don't tend to have a whole lot of regard for your rights, for what, for what makes you happy, what fulfills you as a human being.
Sure.
Because, people say, oh, you don't need this. It's like, well, we actually need a lot more than food, water, air. We have needs for personal fulfillment. We have needs for community. We have needs for all of these things. And, these are ways people satisfy these needs. It's going to be interesting, because I think that they may have bit off more than they could chew, because quite frankly, firearm ownership maybe doesn't have a whole lot of sympathy in Canada, but airsoft, I think, as people are just engaging in a harmless hobby. I mean, the number of killings with an airsoft gun in Canada, I think, is holding steady at 0. And the projection for this year is another 0.
Yeah.
And the projection for the year after that is another 0. So it's...
But they look scary, right?
I mean, they look scary, but people are responsible with them. And, maybe it's time not to be scared of things that just look scary.
100%.
Like...
And it's
somebody having wearing a mask might look scary, but oh well, get over it.
Right. And it strikes me there's already provisions in place. If somebody were to take this scary looking airsoft, now called
absolutely.
Replica, they'll still be charged with a firearms offense if they try and use it at the local liquor store.
Yep. I mean, if you take an airsoft gun and try to rob a liquor store with it, you will be committing very serious firearm-related offenses.
Right.
Because airsoft guns are counted as firearms for most of those provisions. They just don't need a license.
Mm-hmm.
But, they, if you point them at another person without a lawful excuse, and hey, we're playing an airsoft game would be a lawful excuse.
Mm-hmm.
But, I decided to bring this to the supermarket and shoot people in the parking lot would not be a lawful excuse.
Mm-hmm.
You can get charged with pointing a firearm, which is a very serious criminal offense.
Mm-hmm.
So, we're talking about things that are very safe, where, they have a very responsible community. And, that community includes a lot of police officers. It includes a lot of, ex-military or current military.
Mm-hmm.
It includes a lot of people who just want a hobby to, blow off a little steam, to just feel that community and enjoys getting some exercise, right? I mean, sometimes it's tough to drag yourself out to the gym and get some exercise. And the government talks about, oh, well, we need to make sure everybody's, fit and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
But now we need to shut down this sport that is actually keeping some people fit and in shape.
Right. It's easier to run when someone's chasing you with something that will hurt when they shoot you with it.
I mean, that's the thing is, I'm terrible about going to the gym. I've got a treadmill in my garage, and I make it out to use that thing way less often than I should. And, my shirts are starting to show it. So, but when you're out running and you're trying to achieve an objective, you're trying to take that hill, you don't really feel it as much, and you're certainly not as bored. Like, a treadmill is boring.
Mm-hmm.
I have trouble running on a treadmill because I have attention deficit, and it bores me to death.
Uh-huh.
I'm not bored to death when I'm playing airsoft. That's exciting. That's, and I come back and my legs are burning. My lungs are, I've got that ache because my asthma and so forth, but I've actually got that cardio in. Yes, please. I want more of that in my life, not less.
Totally. Attention deficit, huh?
Yeah.
So I was diagnosed with that at an early age, and I think I was on the highest dosage of Ritalin in the province up until about grade 7 there, when I said, that's it, I'm off. They had me on a experimental program. How did you find law school with, is it ADD, ADHD?
I mean, they're all the
same.
Psychologists sort of view them as all the same sort of category here, just kind of different expressions. I tend to be more the daydreamy sort than the bouncing off walls. But I mean, it's got its own challenges, and you have to learn to adapt, and you have to learn that sometimes the strategies that work well for other people aren't what works well for you.
Mm.
And so, but and the other thing that is always a challenge is that if you're known to have, what is classified as a learning disability, applying for jobs gets fun. Because people say, hey, you've got this learning disability. Maybe we don't want to, maybe we're concerned about that.
Mm.
And, that's more so before you get a chance to prove yourself, when you're just coming out of the gate and you're trying to get a foothold.
Right.
But, I've been open about, what I have to deal with, and, the fact that, and I think I'm better for it. Hopefully there's other people out there who are thinking, can I be a lawyer with attention deficit? Yes, you can. You're just going to have to figure out how to make it work for you.
Mm.
But I mean, sometimes it's a matter of like, hey, you've got a deadline. You got to work on that, ahead of time. Or maybe it's just, you got to block out a week to do it. And, you're going to have to figure out some other way to manage your other responsibilities, but you need to just turtle up and, sort of grind this out, even if it hurts.
Mm-hmm.
There's different sort of strategies, and, a good assistant is fantastic.
Yep.
Shout out to Devin here, who, not sure where he is at the moment, but, for many years, he was possibly, I think, the best assistant out there anywhere.
Yeah.
And, I mean, that sort of thing of, you got to maintain a good calendar, because I can't remember those dates in my head.
Right.
If it's, and I mean, just no lawyer can, because you just get too many dates and times to keep track of.
Mm-hmm.
But you have to be super good about that, because if it's something like, I'll just put this in my calendar when I get back to the office.
Oops.
nope, maybe I won't.
Yep.
That's got to go in the calendar right now. And so, getting in the habit, for instance, of I'm leaving the courthouse, I will sit in my car and put an entry in the calendar for each of my upcoming appearances, and then, maybe tidy them up back at the office. But if nothing else, I've got that note, so you don't miss anything. So all of that is really, and I think you have to be more careful about your moods than many people. I think you have to be more careful about, how you eat, how you, where your head's at. Because if you let yourself get into a funk, all of that gets worse and your coping strategies fall to bits. And if I find personally that diet is important, notwithstanding the fact that I drink tremendous amounts of Coca-Cola. Caffeine is, I guess, my replacement for not on any Ritalin or the like. But
Right.
But if I eat heavy, greasy, fast food, I can feel myself having more struggles than if I'm, sometimes you don't want to eat the salad, but the salad is better for my cognition.
That's interesting. I never put a correlation between what I ate and how I was feeling until, I don't know, a couple years ago. I mean, I would eat what I want to eat, obviously try and stay in shape and be healthy and all the rest, but the actual physical and mental feeling off of what I eat and how I feel, for whatever reason, my head's just in different places, and I never put two and two together. I'm like, I was raised on sugar. My grandfather had a bakery, and it was, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago when I finally put that relationship between, wow, that amount of sugar that I'm used to having is actually making me feel like garbage.
Well, and I mean, one of the things I found is, sushi I do fantastic on, although it's expensive and not nearly as good here in Alberta as it was in Vancouver, where I grew up.
Right.
But, I've had things where, I have gone to the Supreme Court once, and I made sure that the meal I had the night before was something that I knew was going to help me and not hurt me.
Interesting.
Because it was just like, this is super important. I got to make sure that I'm squared away and, that my brain is going to be in the right place. Yeah,
makes sense. So speaking of ADHD, if I'm going to quickly change topics right back to firearms here.
Yeah.
So storage of non-restricted firearms, out hunting, common thing we've heard in the past. You're sitting around the campfire and it's getting dark out and everyone's concerned about the grizzly bears, and having a firearm readily available for predator control. And under the storage regulations, they say, hey, it's got to be unloaded. It's got to have a secure locking device or rendered inoperable by removing the bolt or bolt carrier or in a container. But it's got a couple of, and it says it can't be readily accessible to its ammunition, but it has a couple of provisions. And it says it doesn't really apply. The whole having a little lock on it or having it inoperable doesn't apply if you're going to need it for predator control relatively soon. I'm paraphrasing here.
Yeah.
And it also says something along the lines of you don't have to have a lock on it, and it doesn't necessarily have to be, it can have ammunition readily accessible to it. If you're in a remote wilderness area and you're going to be using it for something that's not incompatible with hunting.
Yeah.
Paraphrase.
The area itself has to be not subject to any reasonably ascertainable use incompatible with hunting.
Right.
So if there's people skiing on that hill, then you can't do that.
Right. So, okay, a hunting sort of thing. But of course, you can't hunt at night. But that's when everyone's getting concerned about Bruno the bear coming by.
Yeah.
I guess a couple questions that tend to come up as everyone's playing armchair lawyer around the campfire is like, what's a remote wilderness area, number one? And I mean, that's going to be probably debatable. Obviously not the ski hill. And what's hunting? Like, obviously the actual act of tracking an animal or maybe setting up and waiting for an animal, we can call that hunting. Is driving up hunting? Is getting ready for bed, but we're on a hunting trip and we don't want this bear ripping open the tent. I mean, I've got a blog post of one that just tore apart the side-by-side and was trying to get into to the trailer. I would sure feel safer having a firearm that's loaded and ready to go, maybe not one in the chamber, if I knew that was a legal thing to do.
Well, so the exceptions there's two different exceptions. So one is if you need it for predator control,
right?
You are accepted from the requirement to have a secure locking device, but not from the requirement that it not be readily accessible to ammunition, which to my mind seems to be a little bizarre because you're saying you need to control predators or other animals. And so you don't have to have it locked, but you also can't have the ammunition near it, which, if you're talking about Bruno the bear, is going to be a pretty difficult situation because that's kind of a hurried situation. Now, there might also be the potential that it might be in use for defense against bears, but that's, again, going to be kind of fact-specific and a bit of a question. There's also situations about remote wilderness areas that are not subject to any visible or otherwise reasonably ascertainable use incompatible with hunting. What is a remote wilderness area? Well, whatever the court deems to be a remote wilderness area. And that's going to be that's going to be a fact-specific question, and, it's not always clear what's a remote wilderness area. And it's in all of these cases, it can't be loaded, which again, if, you're talking about your tent and the bear, comes ripping in, you're probably not going to be able to legally store it in a fashion where it's useful in that fashion. But there might be an argument that it's being used for bear defense in those circumstances, so all of this gets tricky and really down to facts, but, so I can't really give you an example, give you like, here's the hard and fast rules, because all of these things are based on some things with some flexibility.
Obviously, with the background that you have on the firearms side and being keenly interested in firearms law based on how vague and poorly written some areas are, and that's kind of a fun game to unpack. Are you familiar with other areas of law that are equally obtuse?
I mean, there's some really weird things that come up with impaired law right now.
Okay.
Like one of the things is that it is prima facie illegal to drive home and then get drunk.
What?
So
to drive home in. Okay.
So let's say you are at work.
Oh, sorry, it's legal, not illegal.
No, illegal.
Illegal. Okay.
Prima facie illegal to drive home and then get drunk.
Okay.
So let's say you have a really tough day at work, or let's say, you get fired, you're having a real rough day. You drive home, and as soon as you get in the door, you put your hat up, you take your jacket off, you go in and you just start pouring yourself shots of vodka. And an hour after you get home, the police knock on your door and you go out to talk to them because you're not making good decisions because you've been hitting the vodka. And the police ask you, when did you get home? And you tell them because, again, not making good decisions. And the cops say, okay, you're under arrest because you were intoxicated within 2 hours of operating a motor vehicle.
Is this like the Monty Robinson workaround? That officer who was in an accident, killed a person and...
Pretty much, yep. Now, I mean, they charged, if I recall correctly, they charged that person with an obstruction of justice. But basically what happened is that they went through and generated a wish list of all the ways people win impaired trials. And so this law was basically a wish list of how to prevent people from getting acquitted on impaired charges. And so, there's a defense that's in that law where you can establish that that you got drunk afterwards, that you had no reason to believe that they were going to ask for a sample, and that your readings are consistent with with having been sober at the time. That's going to be a very expensive defense because the burden is on you, and you're going to have to, hire, amongst other things, a medical expert.
Right.
I will tell you that a medical expert is super expensive.
Mm-hmm.
Like, not even a little bit cheap. They are way expensive. And yeah.
Well, Ian, is there anything that we should be talking about before we kind of look at wrapping up?
I mean, just things are going to be really exciting in the next little bit if you're a gun owner, because the Liberal Party has clearly decided that their path to electoral victory is to throw us under the bus.
Right.
And, it's going to be rough. They want to ban a whole lot of things. And partially that's, I think, because they've, every time they have a poll dip, that's what we're seeing. So, I mean, criminal law is going to continue to be fascinating from my perspective. But for a lot of the people, out there, there's going to be a lot of people just straight up hurt by this.
Right.
And I feel for people. It's, I've had people who are just absolutely, in tears as to what's happening and what's going to happen with their, livelihood. There was a story of a guy who just started up an airsoft business, set to open sometime this week.
Oh, man.
Can you imagine you're just set to, you've just sunk your life savings into an airsoft business?
Mm-hmm.
And then this just gets, this just gets dropped on you?
Devastating.
Yeah. Let's say your business is, you've got an airsoft selling business. Who's going to buy that right now?
Mm-hmm.
If you're trying to sell that. So
no one's going to buy it, at least not for the price that they should.
Oh, I mean, I would be reluctant to buy one of those for $1 right now, let alone for,
right.
So yeah, it's
rough time.
Yeah, I feel for these people. Like, there are people legitimately looking at losing their livelihood, looking at losing their profession, looking at losing everything, like literally everything in some cases. And, I wish I could do more. That's all of it. Is I just wish I had a better way to, ride in and solve the problems. But all I can do is sort of try to poke holes where I can. So,
well, for the listeners, again, that's Runkle of the Bailey. Google it. You'll see Ian there in his Horace Rumpel Homburg hat, the nice ode to the old Bailey barrister. And there will be links in the bio on that. Please check it out. Ian, thank you very much for coming on the podcast and sharing your knowledge. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's been a blast.